Welcome to your first section review. In these lessons, we'll quickly summarize and review everything that we learned in the previous section of the course. So if you feel that you have a good grasp of all of the concepts that we've introduced, you can feel free to skip these lessons. Otherwise, stick around and I'll walk you through all of the key concepts. So in this section, we began by learning about Create React App. Create React App is an NPM library that initializes or creates a new React project with reasonable configuration settings. So it just works simply out of the box with a single terminal command that we run. And in order to use CRA, we used the npx utility, and that is automatically installed with the latest versions of Node and NPM. So what Create React App does, of course, is it hides away most of the complexity, most of the settings of things like Webpack and Babel away from us, and it just creates a basic project, a React project, with some starter files for us to work with, and we are able to immediately get to work writing React code. So how exactly does a React app work? Well, the user receives a bare bones HTML file, and it just has some basic metadata in the head tag, and then an empty div. In our case, our div had an ID of root. And then we use a library called React DOM to find that div and mount, or in other words, initialize the React application in that location, in that div. And that logic was performed in the index.js file in our project. So we provide React DOM with some kind of starter React component, and it knows that that's the beginning component, the most top-level component that it's going to render in that div. And again, moving forward, React is responsible for creating all of the new elements on the page, removing them, updating them, etc. React and JavaScript are fully responsible for changing the UI. The HTML file stays the same, but our JavaScript bundle that contains React swaps components, replaces components, basically modifies the complete user interface for the user. So JavaScript is fully responsible, and that's why our HTML file is pretty empty. And when we render one component, of course, that component can have its own other components, and that relationship can extend multiple levels down. So the browser renders the entire component hierarchy or tree. So what is a component in technical terms? Earlier on, we introduced it in more human terms. We described a component as just a chunk or a piece of the user interface. But in technical terms, a component is a function that returns JSX. Later on, we'll find out there's actually different ways to create components, so it doesn't just have to be a function, but for now, that's the only thing we've learned. So this is as good a definition as we have. And we are welcome to use either arrow functions from ES6 or JavaScript's regular function syntax. It doesn't matter as long as your function returns JSX. And the benefit of this approach is that we can reuse a component in the same way that we can reuse or reinvoke a function, right? So speaking of JSX, what is JSX? JSX is a JavaScript language extension. It is code that looks like HTML, but it evaluates to JavaScript or React function calls when it is transpiled by Babel. So all of the JSX that we've written so far has been in files with a .js extension. We've written this syntax in JavaScript files, even though it looks exactly like HTML. Remember, that is an illusion. It is an abstraction because we see HTML as developers, but it is really JSX, and that code is transformed into method calls on the React library that just become regular JavaScript objects that React uses to create and remove DOM nodes. Our JSX snippets, or in other words, our JSX code, can be used like any other data type. So if you can perform an operation with a number, for example, you can perform it with JSX. So you can store JSX in a constant, or in an array, or an object. You can pass JSX into a function, right? You can have JSX returned from a function, right? So it functions very similarly to any other JavaScript type, but it is effectively a bundle representing some snippet of HTML that will eventually be placed in the browser DOM. Now, there are some slight variations between JSX and HTML, and we'll talk about them throughout the course. The one we saw in this section is that we need to use the class name attribute whenever we want to give a element, a class, instead of the actual class keyword in HTML. So in HTML, it is class. In JSX, it is class name. And that, again, stems from the fact that the class keyword is reserved in JavaScript. And that helps the transpiler figure out what we mean. So that's just to say that there are some slight differences, but they mostly are not that difficult. And you'll very quickly adjust to writing code in JSX because it is mostly the HTML that we all know and love. So next up, we learned about curly braces within our JSX. And as we know, we can use curly braces to present some kind of JavaScript code to evaluate. We can put any valid JavaScript code or expression within that curly brace, and it will be interpreted and evaluated. So as we saw, we can interpolate a constant, we can invoke a function within those curly braces, we can reference an object or an array. All of that is valid syntax, and by default, it will be output to the screen. However, we also saw that we can use curly braces also on our attributes. So for example, we have a sample down below where I have the source attribute on an image, and I'm providing the URL from some constant. And the same rule applies for my alt tag there as well, right? So we can interpolate or inject dynamic JavaScript code directly within our JSX. That is one huge advantage of it over regular HTML. So as far as formatting JSX, when we return JSX from a React component, it's common to wrap the final value, the final JSX/HTML, in opening and closing parentheses, and that allows us to break it up across multiple lines and provide the usual indentation that we provide for HTML with JSX. Later on in the course, we'll introduce a library called Prettier, which will automatically format our JSX code for us, and we won't have to worry about it at all. So don't worry, the community has encountered these problems before, and luckily there are wonderful solutions to help accelerate our productivity and make JSX a lot easier to work with. All right, let's talk about nested components. So components can render other components much in the same way that our HTML elements can nest other elements, right? So the nested component is called the child component, and then the component that renders the child is called the parent component. We did this in our main app component, where our app component rendered a header component, which in turn rendered link and text components, etc. And those components can be duplicated and replicated, and they'll render the exact same JSX each time. But the idea, again, is that we are structuring or combining these components together just like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So a component can serve as both a parent to components and as a child of other components, and that relationship can continue many levels or layers down, and that forms the complete user interfaces. So components form a hierarchy or tree structure, right? A parent has a child, that child has a child, that child has a child. And it works very similarly to how HTML elements are nested, except components are predefined chunks. We can make them as large or as small as they need to be, and then reuse them in different places. So it's almost like taking a chunk of HTML and giving it a name, and then allowing us to reference that name in many different places and reusing that bit of logic over and over again, which of course spares us the duplication and allows us to isolate the logic for that piece, the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, to one function, to one component in our code base. All right, and finally, some additional bits of information that we might have missed that are important to remember. So first up, previous versions of React imported React into any JavaScript file where we used JSX. This is now optional, so you no longer need that import React from React syntax at the top of the file if the file has JSX. There are other use cases where you may want access to that exported React object, but if you're just working with a file that just has components or JSX, you no longer need to import React. You may see that code in older code bases, so don't worry about it, it's totally normal. Speaking of changes, previous versions of React DOM also had a different API. So earlier we imported the render function. Now we create a root, and that root object has a render method. You're typically not going to be overly concerned with that on a day-to-day basis. It's just important to understand that you may see differences across various React code bases. So don't worry, it's just a matter of looking up the old syntax versus the new syntax. It all does the exact same thing at the end of the day. We also talked about hot module reloading, which is a feature where the browser reloads our application whenever we make changes to our components or project files. It obviously makes iteration a lot easier and a lot more fun as a developer because you don't need to restart your server or do anything like that. You simply make your changes and you observe the results immediately in the browser. Keep in mind, as great as this technology is, it's not perfect, especially when you're doing things like deleting files or adding new files. So sometimes if you run into any kind of error with hot module reloading, simply shut the React server down and then start it up again with npm run start. This technology isn't perfect, but it is pretty reliable. Just be prepared to see those kinds of issues in the terminal from time to time. Also, we learned about the idea of ejecting from Create React App, and that means decoupling or separating ourselves from that configuration. We get access to all of the configuration files that CRA creates for us. And as we saw a lesson or two ago, there's a lot of complexity in those files. So I try to avoid ejecting unless it is absolutely necessary for our team's code base, because there may be some kind of complex thing or custom thing that you need to do. Maybe, for example, you need to add support for some kind of very obscure image type that you cannot import into a file because Create React App doesn't support it yet, right? That may be an extreme example of when you might want to eject. But as I mentioned, the Create React App team has contributors from lots of different companies, so they're aware of the kind of problems that developers are facing in the React ecosystem, and they constantly update Create React App every couple months or so to have those support for those features and also upgrade to the latest versions of React and React DOM. That's why it's a great idea to start your new project today using Create React App. All right, that's all there's to cover in this section review, and that also concludes this section. So I hope you've had fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.